Before we begin, Galactic Horrors is now on Patreon. Get daily stories in one place, with no ads and no interruptions. Link is in the description or search Galactic Horrors on Patreon. Now, let's begin the transmission. The ring came out of the ice a meter at a time, black alloy rising from Tombor Basin, as if Pluto had been built around it, rather than the other way around. 3 weeks of cutting nitrogen frost from its surface had exposed only the upper arc. Every meter we cleared pushed the age estimates back another order of magnitude. My structural scans read the material as an alloy outside any classification I had worked with. Tensile strength beyond anything we manufactured, sub-angstrom construction tolerances, and enough thermal stability to sit buried in nitrogen frost for what Pete Sadler's preliminary dating called longer than the solar system has existed, without a single fracture line. I had been an off-world excavation engineer for 15 years, cracking open sealed systems and restoring function to alien ruins on 4 different moons. I had never touched anything built this well. The ring stood 200 meters in diameter where it broke through the basin floor. Its exposed arc rhymed with frozen nitrogen. Our heating elements could barely soften. Carved symbols covered every centimeter of the visible exterior. Tight, precise rows wrapping the circumference like lines of text on a spool. They ran deep into the alloy, each one cut with the same impossible tolerance as the structure itself. Pete had been cataloguing them since week 1. He crouched 20 meters down the arc from me, suit lamp throwing a cone of white across a section he had gridded with adhesive markers. His voice came through the crew channel. "Ray, the syntax on this panel matches the upper register samples. These are operational." "Operational how?" "Hazard designations, prohibition structure. They read like warning labels on a reactor housing, except the content..." He paused. I could hear him selecting words. "The content references imprisoned radiance. Worlds consumed for binding material. A price paid in captured civilizations. That's mythology, Pete. Cultural context around a significant artifact. The linguistic structure is technical. Imperative mood, conditional clauses, specific reference. This reads like an engineering document, and the document says, 'Do not open this.'" I filed it. Pete was good at his work, but his work was translation, and translation of a language no human being had ever spoken carried margins of error wide enough to park a shuttle in. My work was the power conduit architecture I had been mapping through the ring's substrate for 10 days, a branching network of channels that responded to energy input in predictable, testable ways. That was data I could trust. The dig was a 5-man operation. Me, Pete, Commander Lyle Yorin running mission authority, Danny Pruitt handling systems and electronics, and Mark Keating on heavy equipment. We had been dropped on Pluto 9 weeks earlier by a corporate military consortium that had fast-tracked the mission after deep survey probes flagged the ring's energy signature 18 months before. First confirmed precursor artifact in the solar system. Every agency, university, and defense contractor on Earth wanted a piece of it, and the consortium had won the contract by promising activation data within 6 months. Yorin kept the timeline. I kept the engineering. Earth Command, 14 light hours away by signal delay, kept pressure on both of us through daily priority dispatches that read like ransom notes. I was running a continuity scan on the primary conduit junction when Mark's voice came through the channel. Mark had spent 16 years moving equipment on airless rock. He complained about everything, laughed at most of it, and whistled old mining songs over the suitcom whenever channel discipline got loose enough to permit it. This time his voice was flat. "Ray, Commander, you need to see the base perimeter." He had been cutting ice along the ring's foundation with the thermal lance, clearing the lower curve where it plunged beneath the surface. Standard excavation work. Melt, extract, survey, repeat. When I reached him, he had dropped the lance and stepped back, his helmet lamp angled downward. I crossed to his position in the low gravity, each step a controlled lunge over the frozen ground. Yorin came from the habitat side. When I reached Mark's cut line and looked into the trench he had opened, I stopped. Bones. Thousands of them. Alien skeletons knelt in concentric rings around the base of the gate, facing inward, packed so close their shoulders touched. Each skull was fused to the ice surface, bonded at the forehead as if the cold had welded it in place over millennia. Their hands, long-fingered, six-jointed, were locked in a gripping posture, fingers curled around something that was no longer there, frozen in sustained effort. The floodlights caught them in hard, white relief as Mark widened the cut. Row after row, hundreds deep, radiating outward from the ring's base like spokes of a wheel. Some skeletons showed advanced mineral replacement, practically geological. Others were newer, less degraded, their joint structures still partially intact. The arrangement held across all of them, kneeling, fused, hands locked, faces turned toward the ring. "Ritual site," Yorin said. He moved to the trench edge and scanned with his suit instruments. "Religious significance around a major artifact, consistent with precursor cultural patterns we've theorized." Pete arrived last, breathing hard from the crossing. He looked into the trench for a long time before he spoke. "That posture matches a glyph symbol I've been seeing in the prohibition panels. The one I've been translating as a restraint verb. Hold, seal, prevent passage." He pointed at the nearest skeleton's gripped hands. "They're holding the ring shut." "Pete, look at the foreheads." He magnified the feed and threw it to our suit displays. Fine, mineralized threads extended from several skulls into the ice below, and from the ice toward the buried base of the ring. Those are not roots or fractures. They follow the same pattern as the neural interface glyphs. "You're reading a posture from a species we've never met and assigning it meaning based on glyph analysis with a margin of error you've acknowledged is significant." "Yes, but the pattern density is beyond coincidence, Ray. Thousands of bodies, all oriented toward the same structure, all performing the same physical gesture that matches a repeated operational symbol in the glyphs, and if those filaments are what they look like, they were connected to it." Yorin listened to both of us and then asked me for the activation timeline. I told him the conduit system was mapped. I could rig a power feed from our reactor to the ring's primary junction within 48 hours. The architecture showed clear input-response patterns. Energy went in through the conduits and the structure changed state in measurable ways. I was confident I could bring it to full activation. Yorin approved the plan. Pete objected on record, citing the glyph warnings, the skeletons, and the probable biological interface at the base of the ring. Yorin noted the objection, thanked him, and told me to start the power rig. "I'll manage the risk profile from my end," Yorin said as he turned back toward the habitat. The line meant nothing to me at the time. The reactor feed took 36 hours to rig, most of it spent adapting our standard power couplings to conduit channels designed by hands with 6 joints per finger, and engineering principles I was inferring on the fly. Danny Pruitt ran the electronics, soldering bypass circuits and monitoring impedance levels while I crawled through the excavation trench with cable runs and junction boxes. It was good work. Difficult, precise. The kind of problem that rewarded patience and punished assumptions. Danny and I had worked together on 3 prior digs, and we moved through the technical sequence without wasted talk, handing tools back and forth in Pluto's low gravity while the floodlights threw our shadows hard and sharp across the frozen ground. Danny had a way of tapping a sealed coupling twice with the heel of his glove before moving on. He had picked it up on the Miranda spindle after a bad connector almost burned half our instrument rack. Since then, 2 taps meant seated, verified, trusted. I heard it again and again through the suit contact microphones while we worked. Tap, tap, done. Safe. At hour 20, while I was braced under the primary junction and Danny was feeding a relay through the trench, he said, "My wife would hate this place. You told Megan you were going to Pluto. That was the warning label. She said Pluto sounded clean. She likes clean." He passed me a coupling. "This is the kind of place where something looks polished because nothing alive ever had permission to touch it." You used to teach electronics to 12-year-olds, and 12-year-olds know better than to put their hands inside a machine with bones around it. I looked across the trench at him. His helmet lamp hid his face behind reflection. You want that on record? No, Danny said, tapping against the coupling. I want the circuit not to explode. When the rig was ready, I brought the crew to the monitoring station Mark had set up 50 meters from the ring. Pete stood apart, his glyph catalogue open on his suit display, watching the carved symbols for any response to the power feed. Yorin gave me the go-ahead at 0600 mission time. I fed power in stages. The first pulse went through the primary conduit at 12% of reactor output, and the ring absorbed it cleanly. A smooth draw, like water filling a channel, shaped to receive it. At 20%, the carved symbols began to warm. Their temperatures rose in sequence, radiating outward from the primary junction in a pattern that followed the conduit, branching exactly as my mapping had predicted. At 40%, the symbols began to produce light. Soft at first, then brighter, each one activating in the order the power reached it. The ring's surface became a luminous circuit diagram confirming every structural theory I had built over the past 3 weeks. The conduit network was a power distribution system, and I was giving it what it wanted. At 60%, the ring changed state. The center of the ring, the open space framed by the massive arc, developed a visual distortion. The stars visible through that circle shifted, smeared, and vanished behind a membrane I could not describe in terms my instruments supported. My scanner registered the space as simultaneously present and absent, as if the ring's interior had gained values the instrument was never built to measure. The air inside my suit turned metallic on my tongue, which made no sense. The suit atmosphere was sealed, filtered, chemically stable. Ray! Pete's voice came fast. The prohibition glyphs are active, all of them. The entire warning system just came online. I see it. Hold your position. The glyphs described the seal as disengaging. That exact word. Disengaging. Ray, this is a lock. You're opening a lock. He was right. The ring was a lock. The conduit system was the bolt. I had been feeding energy into a locking mechanism, and every watt I pushed through the conduits had weakened it by another increment. I tried to cut the reactor feed. The ring had already locked itself into the draw cycle and absorbed enough energy to complete the cycle on its own. The membrane at its center thinned faster now, becoming transparent to something on the other side, a white brightness with no visible source, pressing against the boundary like water behind a dam. The membrane split. Light came through, dense, structured, carrying weight and pressure that my suit registered as a localized gravitational anomaly. The light gathered, folded, took on complexity and pattern, and then resolved into something I could almost recognize. Wings, layered, interlocking, folded in configurations that shifted faster than my eyes could track. Each layer was covered in structures that I understood with a cold shock of pattern recognition, were eyes. Dozens of them, each one open, each one focused on a different point in the space around the ring, each one burning with a radiance that cast hard shadows in every direction at once. The entity hung in the vacuum above the ring's upper arc, and for 3 or 4 seconds it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Then its light touched Mark Keating's crane rig. The crane arm developed additional surfaces. Edges appeared along the steel and bent in directions my eyes slid off of, as if the metal had gained spatial properties 3-dimensional vision could not resolve. The cable spool at the arm's base unfolded like a flower, each fold revealing internal faces that should never have existed inside a solid steel drum. The hydraulic lines branched and split, turning simple tubing into something architectural and alien and wrong. Mark was standing 6 meters from the crane when the entity's radiance swept over him. His suit developed internal volume. I saw it on my scanner, the suit's dimensions changing, the interior space gaining depth and direction along axes that did not correspond to any physical measurement I knew. Mark started to speak, and his voice came through the channel as a smeared, layered sound. The same words arriving from multiple positions simultaneously, as if his vocal cords had been multiplied and spread across a space wider than his body. Then he came apart. His suit split along seams that had not existed a second earlier, and his body opened outward, each layer unfolding to reveal another beneath it. Muscle, bone, viscera, tissue, all separating and flattening and gaining surface area a human frame could never hold. The process was too fast and too total for Payne to find a pathway. He became a drifting constellation of biological material in Pluto's negligible gravity, each piece still unfolding, still gaining complexity, still being translated into something three-dimensional space could not contain. I grabbed Danny by the arm and pulled him toward the habitat. Yorin was already moving, his voice on the command channel ordering full retreat, emergency seal protocol. Pete had dropped to his knees near the monitoring station. Shock, or the inability to move while watching the entity drift across the excavation site, its radiance transforming everything it touched into variations of itself the terrain could not hold. Danny stumbled against me halfway to the airlock. I caught him, steadied him, and looked down at where my glove gripped his forearm. I could see through his suit, through the fabric, through the insulation layer, through the pressure membrane. His arm was visible inside, muscle and bone rendered in clean cross-section, as if his body had become a diagram of itself. The visibility was spreading. By the time I hauled him through the airlock and Yorin sealed it behind us, Danny's entire left side had gone transparent from shoulder to hip. I could see his ribs, the motion of his lungs expanding and contracting, the branching tributaries of his circulatory system, carrying blood in paths that were, for the moment, still recognizably human. He looked down at himself and said, "Oh God, oh Jesus." The transparency kept spreading. In the habitat's pressurized interior, under the hard white overheads, Danny Pruitt became a living anatomical display. Layers of his body resolved into visibility one after another: skin, muscle, connective tissue, organ structure, skeletal frame, each layer distinct and present at once, as if he existed at every depth of himself simultaneously. His nervous system lit up with visible impulses, bright sparks of bioelectric activity tracing pathways from brain to spine to extremity in real time. Images surfaced inside his torso. A kitchen I did not recognize, a woman's face, a yellow dog on a wooden porch, a classroom with half-built circuit boards spread across child-sized desks, a birthday cake with 7 candles, memories rendered in light playing out inside his ribcage where his organs should have been opaque. Layered over all of it, drifting through his transparent body like smoke through glass were the deaths. A dozen of them, superimposed, Danny falling, Danny burning, Danny asphyxiating, Danny crushed beneath structural collapse, Danny frozen on an open surface, Danny convulsing from radiation exposure. Every possible death his future might hold, playing out in ghostly overlay, each one detailed enough to see the expression on his face as it happened. Danny sat on the habitat floor and watched his own body become a window into everything he was and everything he might suffer. He was still breathing, still conscious, still Danny. "Can you hear me?" I said. "I can hear everything." His eyes stayed on the lights moving inside his own chest. "I can hear my blood, I can hear yours, I can hear something through the hull that sounds like someone singing, except the song has corners." Yorin sealed the inner airlock and started a damage assessment. Outside, through the habitat's shielded viewport, I could see the entity drifting across the excavation site, radiance washing over Mark's crane. The rig was unrecognizable, a twisted sculpture of recursive surfaces and bends the eye could not follow. Mark himself was a dispersed cloud of biological complexity, still drifting, still unfolding. Behind the entity, through the ring, more light pressed against the thinning membrane. More wings, more eyes. The prison held far more than one. Yorin ran his damage assessment. Habitat pressure, holding. Life support, functional. Reactor, still feeding the ring, because the conduit system had locked itself into a draw cycle I could not interrupt remotely. Communications array, degraded. The entity's presence was introducing interference patterns into our signal propagation that dropped the Earth uplink by 30% in the first hour. Danny sat against the habitat wall with his knees drawn up and his transparent body casting layered shadows under the overhead lights. Bone shadows, muscle shadows, nerve shadows, all slightly offset from each other, as if each depth of him occupied a marginally different position in space. He was stable, as far as I could determine, with instruments designed for human physiology. His vitals read normal across every parameter that still applied. The other parameters had become nameless. "The singing is getting louder," he said. "The one through the hull. It's describing the shape of something. A room, maybe. A very large room. White." His eyes tracked something I could not see. "They're in pain, Ray. Whatever's on the other side of the ring. They're in a tremendous amount of pain." Pete had locked himself in the communications bay with every glyph scan he had collected over the past 3 weeks. He came out 2 hours later. "The ring is a dimensional lock," he said. He laid his translation notes on the habitat table, handwritten because his tablet had started developing extra display layers near Danny, and he had stopped trusting it. Precursor construction. Purpose-built to create and seal a pocket of compressed space on the other side of the boundary. The ring generates a stable interface. The conduit system holds that interface sealed. Engaged, the boundary is impassable. Disengaged, it becomes a membrane. "And a membrane can be pushed through," I said. Pete nodded. "Pushed through by what?" Yorin asked. "The glyphs use a term I've been translating as radiant prisoners. Entities native to higher dimensional space. Their bodies are configurations of light and force that physical reality can't contain. Their fundamental nature forces three-dimensional matter into higher dimensional states." Pete looked toward the viewport where Mark's remains drifted across the floodlit basin. The metal unfolding. The equipment gaining structures along new axes. Mark. He was translated. His body was forced into configurations a human structure can't survive. "And Pruitt?" "Partial exposure," Pete said. "Enough to begin the translation, too brief to complete it." Danny looked back at us with eyes transparent enough to show the optical nerves behind them. "He's suspended between states," Pete said. "Part physical, part higher dimensional. The precursors encountered these entities and recognized them as an extinction-level threat to physical reality," Pete continued. "The glyph structure doesn't support malice. They can't control what they do any more than we can control having mass. They exist, and their existence degrades the structural integrity of three-dimensional space around them." "So the precursors built a prison," I said. "They built a prison." Pete tapped his notes. "The restraints holding the entities inside the pocket space were made from compressed matter. The glyphs specify the source material. Planetary bodies, moons, entire worlds crushed to densities sufficient to anchor higher dimensional beings." He stopped. The habitat seemed to shrink around the silence. "And the worlds were inhabited when they were compressed," he said. "The glyphs list populations, civilizations, biospheres, all of it forged into binding material." Outside, a second entity emerged from the ring. It drifted alongside the first, their radiance fields overlapping. Where those fields intersected, the surrounding terrain compounded its deformation. Ice gaining crystalline structures that grew upward in branching patterns and cast shadows in directions the sun was not. "The skeletons," Yorin said. "Seal maintenance," Pete said. "The lock degrades over time. The glyphs describe dimensional erosion, the boundary wearing thin under pressure from inside. The precursors maintained the seal through physical vigil. Continuous presence at the ring's perimeter. Living neural tissue interacting directly with the membrane. They knelt at the ring and held the seal and died at their posts, and the next generation replaced them, and the next and the next." "The last generation had no replacements," I said. "The last generation died, and the seal began degrading on its own, slowly, geological timescales. It was still holding when we arrived, thin, weakened but intact. Pete looked at me. Ray's power feed finished what erosion started. I let that sit where it landed. I had opened the prison. My engineering analysis had been correct about the ring's architecture and wrong about its purpose, and the distance between those two facts had killed Mark Keating and was currently turning Danny Pruitt into something that cast shadows along axes that should not exist. Yorin stood. "Brennan, walk with me." He led me to the far end of the habitat, past the sleeping bays, into the narrow maintenance corridor, where the air recyclers lined the walls. He sealed the corridor hatch behind us. "My suit carries 6 folded nuclear charges rated at 50 megatons each," he said. "Shaped yield design built to destabilize Pluto's core mass and collapse it into the ring's boundary. My orders from Earth Command are to detonate if communication drops below 40% of baseline, or if I assess the situation as uncontainable through other means." I stared at him. "This is information I would have preferred to keep classified," Yorin continued. "Pruitt is undergoing a psychological crisis that does not need additional fuel. Sadler is a linguist on his first deep space assignment. You are the only person on this crew with the technical background to understand what I'm telling you and the operational experience to factor it into a decision. You're carrying enough yield to shatter this entire body, and your plan is to drop the rubble on the gate. Earth Command's plan. The theory is that sufficient mass collapse would seal the boundary through gravitational compression, bury the interface under enough matter, and the boundary becomes impassable. That's a guess, Commander. They're 14 light hours away, and they've never seen a dimensional boundary. If the collapse fractures the ring instead of burying it, you release everything that's still inside with nothing between it and the inner solar system. I agree the risk is substantial, which is why I am giving you a window to find an alternative." Yorin's voice carried no drama. He was a man with a schedule and a threshold, and he was telling me where the lines fell. "Current uplink is at 68% of baseline and degrading. If it reaches 40, I execute my orders. If you can present a containment or resealing solution before that threshold, I will support it fully. If you can't, I carry out what Earth Command has instructed me to do." "How long do I have?" "At the current rate of signal degradation, 8 to 12 hours. I walked back to the main compartment. Danny was staring at the viewport, watching the two entities drift across the ruins of our excavation site. Their radiance had eaten the monitoring station down to its foundation bolts. Inside Danny's transparent chest, 3 of his possible deaths were cycling with increasing frequency. Freezing, asphyxiation, and a third I could not identify. Something that looked like his body dissolving into pure light from the center outward. "Danny." He turned. Through his transparent skull, I could see the synaptic cascade his brain produced in response to hearing his own name. A bright, branching pattern racing from auditory cortex to frontal lobe and then dispersing into a dozen smaller signals I could not trace. "You said you can hear them. The entities. Through the hull. I can hear the shape of where they came from. The white room." His fingers pressed against the floor. "It's shrinking, Ray. Closing in on them. Whatever's on the other side of that ring, it's a box and the walls are moving inward. They ran because the box is crushing them." Pete had come to stand beside me, his glyph notes in hand. His expression told me he had heard Yorin's conversation through the habitat's thin walls, or enough of it to understand the countdown. "The glyphs describe a resealing mechanism," Pete said quietly. "Interior accessible. It can be engaged from inside the prison space as long as the dimensional lock is still structurally intact on this side." "Is the ring still capable of sealing?" "The ring is undamaged. The lock disengaged cleanly. Your power feed did exactly what it was designed to do, just for the wrong purpose. In principle, the sealing mechanism should still function. Then I go through." Pete's grip tightened on his notes. Danny's cycling deaths shifted. The light dissolution one moved to the foreground, playing out in vivid detail inside his ribcage, his face in the image calm and wrong. The glyphs describe the interior as a compressed dimensional pocket containing entities whose passive radiance translates physical matter into higher dimensional states, Pete said. You understand what that means for a man in a pressure suit. I understand that we have somewhere between 8 and 12 hours before Yorin turns this moon into gravel and prays the rubble lands on the right spot. You have the glyph translations. I have the engineering training. Walk me through what the resealing mechanism looks like and tell me how to reach it without ending up like Mark. Pete sat down at the habitat table. He spread his notes under the white overheads and started talking me through the glyphs that described the entry protocol. The approach vector, the energy state, the specific way a physical body had to present itself to the membrane to pass through without being translated. The instructions were detailed, and they were old, and they had been written by hands with 6 jointed fingers for bodies shaped differently than mine. Outside, a third entity pressed through the ring. The habitat lights dimmed, recovered, dimmed again. Danny tracked something invisible across the ceiling, with eyes that were windows into a brain I could watch thinking. Inside his chest, the futures narrowed. I started checking my suit seals. Pete's entry protocol took 40 minutes to walk through. The glyphs described a specific approach: passive body state, minimal electromagnetic output, suit systems cut to life support only. Everything else powered down so the membrane would register me as inert matter and translate me through without applying the full conversion. The protocol had been written for precursor bodies, 6 jointed hands, and a neural architecture shaped differently than mine, and Pete was adapting it in real time with margins of error he would not quote me. I stood at the ring's center with a tether line locked to hull anchors on the Pluto side, and my suit stripped to its survival minimum. 3 entities drifted across the excavation site behind me, their overlapping radiance fields turning the frozen terrain into a garden of crystal that grew upward in branching formations no terrestrial mineralogy could explain. My suit's outer layer had already developed a dimensional texture from ambient exposure, surfaces that caught light at angles the material should not have had. Passive entry, Pete said through the comm. Let the membrane read you. If you fight the translation pressure, you'll activate the full conversion. Understood. Talk me through the interior when I have signal. And Ray, the glyphs say the interior space is compressed. Time, distance, dimensional properties, none of it maps to anything we'd recognize. Trust your tether. If you lose orientation, follow the line back. I stepped forward into the membrane. The transit felt like falling through water that had weight and direction and opinion. My suit instruments died. My body registered pressures from axes I could not name. A sense of being read, measured, catalogued by something structural and vast and old. The membrane moved through me as much as I moved through it, and for a span of time I could not measure. I existed in neither space, suspended in the boundary itself, dimensionally thin. Then the white opened around me, and I was through. The space inside was white the way deep ocean is dark. Totally, structurally, as a fundamental property of the medium. It had depth and texture and weight. It pressed against my faceplate with something that registered as light and pressure and temperature simultaneously. Radiance generated from every direction at once. My suit instruments stuttered back to partial function, feeding me readings that scrolled through values too fast to track. Spatial dimensions registering as 4, 5, 7, 4 again, as if the space kept revising how many axes it contained. The angels hung in the white like flies in amber. Hundreds of them. I could count at least 300 from my entry position, and the white extended far beyond the limits of my suit's ranging laser, which meant hundreds more waited in the depths. Their radiance was dim, guttering, weak, a fraction of the power the escaped entities carried on Pluto's surface. Wings folded tight, eyes half-lidded, bodies drawn in on themselves. They were chained. The chains ran from every angel to anchor points distributed throughout the white space. Each link was forged from matter so compressed it had its own measurable gravity. My suit picked up microgravitational signatures from individual segments, each one denser than the core of a collapsed star. And inside the compression, visible through some property of the white space that made density transparent, I could see what the matter had been before it was crushed. Planetary surfaces, geological strata, sedimentary layers, igneous intrusions, tectonic fault lines, compressed to the thickness of paper and folded into the chain metal like pages in a book. Coastlines, ocean beds, their water squeezed to molecular films that still carried the imprint of current patterns. And built on those surfaces, pressed flat alongside the geology, were cities, infrastructure, roads and foundations and architectural remnants, all compressed so thoroughly that entire urban grids occupied millimeters of chain width. I could see the regularity of planned settlement, the branching patterns of transit systems, the clustered density of population centers, flattened to foil and woven into restraints. Inside some links, preserved like insects in glass, I could make out biological remains. Bodies, millions of them per chain segment. Billions, if the lengths I could see were representative of the whole system. My mind tried to convert the observation into scale, mass, population, construction cost. It failed. The numbers would not hold still. Every estimate became an obscenity before I could finish it. The chains carried worlds, populated worlds. The precursors had crushed everything those worlds contained, their land, their water, their people, and wound the wreckage into rope. And the rope was tightening. I could see it in the structural deformation, links compressing against each other, anchor points drawing inward, distances between fixed positions measurably shorter than the engineering tolerances would have specified at construction. The white space was contracting. Slowly, on a timescale my instruments could not fully resolve, the prison was shrinking, grinding the chains tighter, crushing the compressed worlds further, dragging the angels inward with the closing walls. The chains were restraints and millstones both. The prison was turning them. The nearest angel lifted its head as I drifted closer. Its eyes, dozens of them, each one larger than my helmet, opened and focused on me, with an attention that pressed against my suit like a physical hand. It watched me the way a trapped animal watches a door. Its wings shifted, unfolding one layer, and I saw damage, burns and fractures in the light structure, places where chain compression had begun to degrade its body. It was in pain. The expression was readable across species, across dimensional states, across every barrier that separated what I was from what it was, agony and exhaustion. The entities that had poured through the ring had been fleeing. I found the resealing mechanism 7 meters from the interior face of the membrane, mounted on a structural array that corresponded to the conduit system I had mapped from outside. The engineering was recognizable: junction points, power channels, locking interfaces, scaled for 6-jointed precursor hands but built on principles I could follow. Pete's voice came through my comm in fragments, the signal shredding as it crossed the boundary. Between the garbled syllables and the glyph translations he fed me, I assembled enough to understand what the mechanism needed. Power input from outside, the same conduit system reversed. Structural engagement of the locking interfaces on both sides of the membrane. And an anchor, a living consciousness, transformed enough to exist in both dimensional states simultaneously, physically present inside the prison space to hold the boundary coherent at the junction point. The mechanism had a socket for it, a gap in the structural array shaped for something that bridged physical and higher dimensional states. The precursors had built the anchor point into the architecture the way a mason builds a keystone into an arch. Remove it and the whole system loses coherence. The seal held because something alive was wedged into the gap, keeping the boundary from drifting apart. The current anchor socket was empty. Whatever consciousness had last held it had degraded past function long before we arrived. I looked at the socket. I looked at the angels chained in the white. I looked at the compressed worlds forged into their restraints. I understood, with the clean and cold clarity that comes from being an engineer who has identified the missing component, that I had exactly one replacement part available. I followed the tether line back through the membrane. The habitat's interior had degraded during the hours I had been gone. Danny's proximity was warping the overhead light fixtures, bending the output spectrum toward frequencies that gave every surface a dimensional shimmer. Pete's handwritten notes were still spread on the table, but the paper had developed a translucency near the edges closest to Danny, as if the medium itself was beginning to lose its commitment to being fully three-dimensional. Yorin met me at the inner airlock. Uplink is at 52%. I found the resealing mechanism. It works. The locking system is intact. The interfaces are accessible from both sides, and Pete's translations give me enough to operate it. What's the cost? I told him. I told all three of them, because Danny deserved to hear it from me, and because the engineering was simple enough that euphemism would have been an insult. The seal required a living anchor inside the prison space. The anchor had to be a consciousness that existed in both physical and higher dimensional states. The mechanism had a structural socket built for exactly that kind of bridge. Danny Pruitt was the only person within 14 light hours of Pluto who had been partially translated by angel light and was still alive and still conscious and still shaped enough like a human being to understand what I was asking. I laid it out in technical terms first, because that was how I processed it. Then I stopped talking and let Danny ask the questions the technical language had been designed to delay. You're asking me to walk into a collapsing prison and become part of the lock. The mechanism needs a living anchor inside. You're the only one whose body fits the socket. While the prison crushes everything inside it, while the chains made from dead civilizations grind tighter, while those things scream around me and I hold the door shut so they can keep screaming. While all of it happens, I said, while you're aware of it. Danny stared at me. Inside his transparent skull, I could see the storm of neural activity that my answer produced, bright cascades racing through cortical pathways, the architecture of terror and fury rendered in bioelectric light. You opened it, Ray. You powered it up and cracked the seal because you were so goddamn sure you knew what the engineering meant, and now you want me to crawl inside and hold it shut with my body because you don't have another wrench that fits. That's exactly what I'm asking. My throat closed around the rest of it. The apology was there, useless and ready. And there is nothing I can say about the cost that would be adequate. You're right about that. His voice cracked along a line that had nothing to do with his transformation. You went in there and came back. I go in and stay. No one answered him. What happens to me inside? Am I conscious? Do I feel the walls closing in? Pete answered because I could not. The glyphs describe the anchor as a sustained presence, active consciousness maintained by the interaction between the bridge state and the boundary. The anchor is aware. For how long? Pete looked at his notes. He looked at the table. He looked at Danny. The glyphs use a time unit I can't convert with confidence, based on the degradation rates described for the previous anchor. Centuries, at minimum. The silence in the habitat had weight. Danny's possible deaths, cycling inside his chest, had reduced to 2, the light dissolution, and a new one I had not seen before. Danny suspended in white space, chains tightening around luminous bodies beside him, his own body dimming by degrees over a span of time that made human lifespan irrelevant. His face in that image was awake. His eyes were open. He was watching it happen to himself for centuries. Yorin said, "Uplink at 49%, gentlemen." Danny pressed his transparent palms against the habitat floor and pushed himself upright. The floor dimpled where his hands made contact, a dimensional distortion, the material bending along an axis it had not possessed the previous day. "I can feel what's happening outside," Danny said. "The 3 of them, the ones loose. I can feel what their radiance is doing to the ice, to the bedrock, to the dimensional structure of everything within a kilometer of the ring. It's spreading, Ray. Another few hours and this habitat loses structural coherence. Another day, and the effect reaches a self-sustaining threshold. It propagates on its own, space itself unfolding because they taught it how. He looked at Yorin. Your charges might work, or they might scatter 3 higher-dimensional beings across the solar system, with nothing between them and 8 billion people. You want to gamble on which one? I do not, Yorin said. Danny looked at me. The resentment in his expression was visible in every transparent layer. The muscle tension, the neural patterns, the flush spreading through exposed vasculature like ink diffusing through water. Get the tether ready, he said. Reconfigure it for a permanent anchor point. Danny, don't. His hands curled. Inside his chest, the image of the white prison kept repeating. Don't you dare tell me you're sorry. We rigged the tether in 90 minutes. I reconfigured the anchor connections from retrieval to fixed mount, locking the line to the ring's structural frame with redundant attachments designed to hold against dimensional stress. Pete walked Danny through a modified entry protocol, slower, more controlled, designed to preserve Danny's bridge state through the transit rather than shield him from translation. Danny needed to arrive inside the prison as exactly what he was, half human, half something else, a living junction between dimensional states. He stood at the ring's center in his pressure suit, tether locked to his harness, his transparent body casting that impossible layered shadow across the frozen ground. Inside his chest, the cycling futures had collapsed to one. A single image, playing on steady repeat. Danny in the white space, suspended, the anchor socket fused to his body, the prison walls closing over years that would feel like minutes or centuries, depending on which layer of his consciousness was counting. When you're through, I said, move toward the mechanism array. 7 meters from the interior membrane. Pete will guide you to the bearing. The anchor socket is at the base of the central junction. You'll recognize it. It's the empty space in the system where the keystone used to be. And when I lock myself into it, I engage the seal from this side. Pete guides me through the exterior sequence. The membrane thickens, the lock re-engages, and the boundary goes solid. With me on the inside. With you on the inside. Danny looked out across the excavation site. The 3 escaped entities had drifted farther from the ring, their radiance fields eating into terrain that was becoming permanently altered. Crystal growth, dimensional texturing, ice reforming along axes terrestrial physics had never authorized. Mark Keating's remains were still dispersed among them, each fragment still unfolding, a slow-motion catastrophe that had been a colleague and a friend 6 hours ago. Danny raised one transparent hand and tapped the tether coupling twice. Then he stepped into the membrane. The transit was slow. His bridge state made the crossing gradual, visible, his body entering the boundary like a man wading into heavy water. I watched him thin, stretch, gain luminous properties as the membrane read his hybrid physiology and translated it inward. His suit camera fed back to my display, and for a few seconds the image showed both spaces simultaneously, Pluto's black surface behind him, the white interior ahead, Danny suspended between them as exactly the kind of thing the prison was designed to consume. Then he was through, and the beacon lit. Danny's transformed body, fully immersed in the prison's dimensional medium, began radiating. Angel light poured from him, reflected, refracted, amplified by the bridge state that the prison's architects had designed the anchor to produce. On my suit camera feed, I could see the nearest chained angels react, their half-closed eyes opening, their damaged wings shifting toward the source. On Pluto's surface, the 3 escaped entities stopped drifting. They turned, all 3, simultaneously, oriented toward the ring, toward Danny, toward the signal of their own radiance coming from inside the prison, calling them back the way a signal fire calls ships from open water. They're moving, Pete said from the monitoring position, tracking what remained of our sensor grid. All 3 converging on the ring. 6 minutes to transit, maybe less. I moved to the ring's exterior mechanism. The conduit junction points, the locking interfaces, the structural elements that corresponded to what I had mapped from inside. Pete fed me glyph sequences through the comm, and I worked the system in order. Power reversal through the primary conduit, engagement of the secondary locks, structural realignment of the interface towards sealed configuration. My gloves were clumsy on components shaped for alien fingers. The ring's surface gained temperature from the approaching entity's radiance, the alloy warming under my palms as three convergent fields of higher dimensional force closed on my position. "Danny, report your status," I said into the comm. His voice came back layered, human speech wrapped in harmonic resonances that the suit microphone rendered as distortion and overtone. "I can see the socket. I'm at the base of the junction." A pause. Static. Breath. "Ray the chains, up close. I can see what's inside them. I can see their faces." "Stay on the task. Lock yourself into the anchor point." "Billions of them, Ray. Whole species, children. They crushed children into chain metal and called it a necessary measure." "Danny, the anchor point. I'm engaging." His voice shuddered into harmonics. "I'm doing it. Tell me when the exterior locks are ready." The first entity reached the ring. It passed through the membrane in a wash of radiance that turned my suit display white and forced me to work by touch alone. Gloved fingers finding conduit junctions by memory and training, while the dimensional field scoured every surface within 10 meters. My suit's outer layer gained new properties, textures and edges the material had never carried and would never shed. I kept working. Pete's voice stayed in my ear, calling glyph sequences. My hands stayed on alien engineering. The second entity passed through, and the radiance doubled. The conduit interface I was holding grew warm enough to feel through insulated gloves. "Danny, are you anchored?" His response came in fragments, syllables of English broken by intervals of something that carried pitch and dimensional properties my comm system could only render as static and strange harmonics. Underneath the fragmentation, I caught the word engaged and the word hurts, and a third sound that might have been my name spoken from a mouth losing its shape for human vowels. The third entity entered the ring. I engaged the final locking sequence. The membrane thickened. I could feel it through my gloves, a structural shift, the interface gaining density and solidity. The thinness I had broken with my power feed rebuilding from both sides as the locking mechanism re-engaged. The conduit system reversed its draw, pulling power back through the channels, and the carved glyphs dimmed in sequence, each symbol cooling, darkening, settling back into inert alloy as the seal restored itself section by section around the ring's full circumference. Danny's camera feed degraded as the membrane closed. The last image I received showed white space, chained figures, three newly arrived entities drifting toward the anchor point, where Danny's body was producing a radiance that had become self-generated, architectural, the output of a mechanism integrating a living man into its structural array. He was becoming part of the system. The socket was fusing him into the architecture, and his body was responding by producing the bridge function the prison required. A living keystone wedged into the arch, holding the boundary coherent through the sustained effort of a consciousness that existed in both states at once. His last transmission arrived as the membrane sealed to opacity. 3 seconds of audio that my suit recorded and that I would later play back dozens of times in the quiet of a ship bunk on the long transit home. The first second was Danny's voice, damaged and carrying harmonics that a human throat should never produce, saying something that might have been "tell them" or "felt them" or "held them." The second second was a tone, pure, complex, carrying spatial properties that the recording flattened to a sound like a bell struck inside a space the size of a planet. The third second was silence. The ring went dormant. The glyphs cooled to dark. The membrane became opaque, then solid, then simply the interior surface of an ancient alloy ring resting in nitrogen frost on the surface of Pluto, sealed and cold and carrying no sign of what it held inside. I pulled my hands off the ring and stepped back. My gloves had bonded to the alloy where the dimensional effects had altered their surface chemistry. I had to tear the material free, leaving smears of suit fabric against the carved symbols like shed skin. Pete crossed the excavation site to stand beside me. The floodlights illuminated the ring, the ruined equipment, the drifting remains of Mark Keating, and the crystalline distortions in the ice that would never revert to normal terrain. The silence was total. Pluto has no atmosphere to carry sound, and the singing Danny had heard through the hull was gone. Yorin opened his suit's command interface and entered a disarmament code. The process took 90 seconds of careful sequence input. When it was done, he looked at me across the excavation site. "I'll file the preliminary report," he said. "Classification level is above my authority. Above yours." I stood at the ring's base and looked down into the trench where the precursor skeletons knelt in their thousands. Row after row, skulls fused to the ice, hands locked in the same gripping posture, every body oriented toward the structure they had spent their lives maintaining. I had read them wrong from the first day. Yorin had called them worshippers. Pete had called them guards. They were something simpler and worse. They were the ones who knew. Each generation, someone had operated the seal and fed a life into the anchor socket, and then the others had knelt at the ring's perimeter, their neural tissue tied into the outer seal, because they could not bring themselves to leave. They had been sitting with what they had done, living beside the knowledge that someone they had chosen was inside, awake, feeling the walls close over centuries, and that the prison would need a new anchor in a few hundred or a few thousand years. When it did, someone would stand where they had stood and pick the next name. I knelt. I lowered myself to the ice beside the nearest row of skeletons and took their posture. Knees on frozen nitrogen, head bowed toward the ring, hands extended toward the base. The cold came through my suit in seconds, sharp and total, the kind of temperature that would kill an unprotected man in minutes. The posture felt like what it was: resignation, the physical grammar of a person who has done something permanent and understands the debt. I held it for 10 seconds. Then I stood and walked back toward the habitat. Behind me, the ring sat in the ice. Danny Pruitt was inside it, awake, holding the boundary shut with his body while compressed worlds ground tighter around chained beings who had been trying to die for longer than Earth had existed. The seal would hold. For a while, dimensional erosion would start again. The anchor would degrade. The membrane would thin. Eventually, someone would come back to Pluto with instruments and ambition and the same confidence I had carried 9 weeks ago. They would need someone who understood the mechanism, someone who could explain what it cost, someone who could point at the ring and say, "This is a lock, and the lock requires a key, and the key is a human life." The last key was a systems technician named Danny Pruitt, who went through the membrane with his eyes open and his future narrowed to a single image that would play out over centuries. I was that someone now. I would carry it for the rest of my life. And when the seal began to weaken, in 50 years or 500, the report Yorin was about to classify would surface from some buried archive, and a man in a uniform would find my name attached to it. He would come looking for me, or for my grave, with questions I had already written the answers to. The habitat airlock cycled open. I stepped inside. The overheads were steady. The life support was holding. The communications uplink was climbing back toward baseline strength as the last dimensional interference faded from Pluto's surface. I sat down at the habitat table where Pete's glyph notes were still spread under the lights, and I started writing my own report, the one that would contain everything Yorin's classification would bury. The anchor mechanism, the entry protocol, the socket specifications, the cost, everything a future crew would need to know when the seal wore thin and the machine needed feeding again. Outside, the precursor dead kept their vigil in the ice, kneeling toward a ring that held its silence like a promise it intended to break.